Okay, welcome folks. Thanks for coming along to this briefing session. My name is Robert Macintosh. I'm based at Northumbria University. I'm one of the co-investigators leading the EDI Caucus, and I'm responsible for workstream 2 and responsible largely therefore for the second round of so-called flexible funding associated with the caucus. And this is an information session around the submission of full applications to that flexible fund. We had a compulsory expression of interest phase, which has now completed. And I'm guessing if you're on this call, you were likely one of those people who expressed an interest in submitting to the flexible fund. And hopefully this afternoon's session will allow you the chance to hear a little bit more about that process and to ask any questions that you have. Just before we start into the session proper, a few bits of housekeeping. The EDI Caucus does have a code of conduct. It's available on our website. We really want the EDI Caucus in general, and specifically any events, including today's events, to feel like a safe space. And so we reserve the right to remove people from the meeting if there was any form of inappropriate, abusive language or questioning. I'm sure that that won't happen, but we open our sessions with that little preamble. In the Q&A session, if you could use the question and answer function in the webinar, which is just slightly different than a regular Zoom or Teams call. So there is a Q&A function. If you want to ask a question, please ask it there. And myself or Katrine or Fenella, who are helping facilitate this afternoon session from the EDI Caucus team, will clock that. And if for some reason you can't access that and you want to use the raise hand facility, you could do so, and we'll try to come to you for questions. I can see that closed captioning has been activated by somebody on the call, and so if you need that for accessibility purposes, please do say. And if you want to ask a question in a different way, then we'll try to find a way of getting your question into our conversation. So hopefully all of that is clear and familiar to you. And with that, Katrine, could we move on to our next slide? So we'll start with just a little overview of what the caucus is about. I'm sure some of that will be familiar to you, but just in getting us all to the same page at the beginning of our conversation, we'll do that. We'll talk a little bit about the purpose of the caucus, what the flexible fund is around, how the round 2 process will operate or is operating, what the application process looks like, and then I will try to make sure that we've reserved the majority of our time for questions and answers towards the end. So if we move on, Katrine. So the Caucus was funded by a consortium of research councils under the umbrella of the UKRI and the British Academy. It's managed by a team of people drawn from a range of different settings. As you can see on the screen here, Professor Kate Sang, who isn't with us this afternoon, is the principal investigator and is leading Workstream 1. Professor Jemina Napier, who's also at Heriot-Watt with Kate Sang, is the deputy PI and has the EDI leadership responsibility for the caucus as a whole. I'm leading Workstream 2, and I'm based at Northumbria, as I said earlier. James Richards is leading Workstream 3. He's based at Heriot-Watt. And then there's actually a large selection of co-Is involved in the programme as well, but Catherine Souch from the Royal Geographic Society is the engagement lead. Clay McGill from Heriot-Watt is our neurodiversity champion. Lizzie is on a period of parental leave and has been replaced by Katrine, who's on this call as the manager of the caucus, and Fenella, who's also on this call, is the manager of the support officer for the project. And Rustrum looks after the finances of what is a big and complicated project. So that's who we are. And as I said, there's a collection of co-investigators also associated with the project. I wouldn't run through all of the details of that, except to say that Marion Hirsch, who is in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen at University of Glasgow, is associated with Workstream 2 and therefore associated with the flexible fund call that we'll be discussing this afternoon. And Clay McGill, who was on the previous slide, is also involved in that. There are a collection of 5 postdoc researchers involved in the caucus as a whole. Kat Morgan and Steffi Schneider in this slide are the 2 PDRAs who are working closely with Workstream 2. So that's a little overview of the big team that is delivering the caucus, and we're about partway through our first year in being fully staffed. We have a number of partners supporting the project, including the National Museum of Scotland and York University in Canada, rather than York University here, and the Doctoral Centre for Training, and the EDICa project, which is housed at Heriot-Watt around decarbonisation and research and innovation. The purpose of the caucus is really to look at research and innovation cultures. And one of the things that I always stress when I'm talking about the EDI caucus is that it is obviously going to involve lots of interest in the higher education sector, so people who work in universities like myself, and I'm sure many of you on the call. But research and innovation doesn't just happen in university settings, it also happens in a range of public and private organisational settings beyond the university. And there really is an importance around making sure that we clock both research and innovation, and that we clock that in both higher education settings and beyond higher education settings. And the intention is to try and improve the nature of people's experience in research and innovation careers, looking at the cultures, processes and practices that bring people into those careers, support them during their careers, allow them to thrive and progress, and retain them in those careers in ways which are more inclusive. And it's particularly interested in looking at the barriers that people experience in that setting around a variety of protected characteristics. We act as a focal point for the research and innovation system in the UK, and that's why the funding partnership around UKRI and the British Academy is important, because it touches on most, if not all, of the research funding landscape for research and innovation work. And the intention over the life of the caucus is to identify things that make a difference in terms of policy and practice, and to disseminate those as widely as possible across a range of disciplines and settings and career settings in order to improve practice around that. And if we move on to the next slide, Katrine. So the Caucus Award, which was made to Professor Kate Sang as the PI and to myself and the rest of the Caucus team, is like many other research projects. It funds some of our time to enable us to do this research. But as a particular design feature of this caucus and the Research and Innovation Caucus and one or two other Network Plus models, UKRI has begun over the last few years to use this so-called flexible fund modelling. So in our award, there was roughly £1 million over the 3 years of the EDI caucus that was designed to be dispensed at 3 stages. So there'll be 3 rounds. This is the second of them. And notionally, therefore, the kind of rough spend for flexible fund round 2 will be just over £300,000. But the intention there is to commission others to do research to support the work of the caucus. So there's a research team in the core of the EDI caucus. We have made a number of awards through the flexible fund round 1, and they've just been announced. We are expecting proposals over the next month or so to arrive for flexible fund round 2, and they will be commissioned pieces of research that you would be leading if you apply. The intention, there are some parts of how we are doing that commissioning which are important to notice. All of the applications that we want to support have to feature co-design. So there is an intention that this is a co-design rather than a kind of traditional academic theory then practice model. We're looking to prioritise those projects and proposals that are led by underrepresented or marginalised communities in the research and innovation ecosystem. And we're particularly looking for projects that are capable of delivering impact and making a difference. That's not impact per se in the traditional REF terminology. We don't expect REF impact cases. It's more in the lay usage of that, making a difference in the world. So we want to see concrete, actionable, practicable advice that makes a difference in how people's experience in their research and innovation career unfolds around them. So that might be in the way of advice or policy and practice changes. It might be around new evidence as to what works and why. It might be new data sets that are brought forward from the work, and it might be all of the above. And if we move on to the next slide, Katrine. So let's talk just for a moment about Flexible Fund Round 2 and how that relates to Workstream 2. Workstream 2 is particularly interested in the research and innovation process and the EDI literacy of researchers and innovators who work inside that system. And the focus for Flexible Fund Round 2 is largely about trying to find ways of enhancing the diversity of voices and ideas and experiences and perspectives that are brought to bear in research and innovation settings. And in particular, we're interested in exploring how EDI concerns play out in settings where you're applying for limited research funds. And in that, some way, there's a mirroring of that process in the Flexible Fund itself. We have a larger number of applications that we will be able to support from the £317,000 that we have at our disposal. And so there'll be some process of making judgments as to which projects to support and why. That's why we want to have this briefing session. But for many of us, progress in our academic or innovation career depends on securing the support to do the research to build the findings and insights, whilst in parallel accruing career capital and benefits and reputation and experience that would allow us to continue to do that work. In Flexible Fund Round 2, the projects are mandated to be of 12 months or less in duration and to produce actionable outcomes, as we said. And the size of the award, which is one of the things that might be a question towards the end, in theory, we could support one project of roughly £300,000. In theory, we could support 300 projects of roughly £1,000. The balance that we're trying to strike is to create a collection, a manageable collection of projects that do interesting, innovative, provocative work that represent ways in which we can support a wider range of people into research and innovation careers. We don't have fixed tariffs for the maximum or minimum spend associated with a project, but I will share some thoughts with you this afternoon about what happened in Flexible Fund Round 1 and what we learned from that process. So one of the things that you might be most interested in this afternoon's briefing session is about the evaluation criteria and how we are going to evaluate proposals when we make those decisions. We have already said expect your proposal to develop a co-design approach, and that would include how key stakeholders or end users of the research are engaged, not just in the project, but in the formulation of the project and its execution and its dissemination and delivery. And that's because we want to make sure that we're doing research with rather than just research on research and innovation careers. And so in the EDI Caucus proposal that we submitted and that was where the funding was awarded, workstream 2 is adopting a participatory action research method, which I'm happy to say more about in the Q&A if people are interested. And the proposal should address some kind of evidence gap, i.e. somewhere where we think there is an issue around bringing marginalised or underrepresented voices or perspectives into research and innovation settings, and how one might address that evidence gap. And in the caucus itself, we will shortly publish our first evidence review of the things that we see in the EDI literature around research and innovation careers. So the proposal might adopt or propose a pilot around an intervention intended to include more, for example, women or people with disability or a particular community or ethnicity or demographic or subject area into a type of career. And it could be that in doing that, that is the main purpose of the research, and or it could be that the part of that is about creating an evidence base about what works in what circumstances and why. So if we move on. We are looking for proposals to create an impact. So that focus on what works and why is about trying to improve the prospects of marginalised and underrepresented communities in research and innovation settings. And so that focus on making a difference is really important in the proposal. And we are particularly interested in seeing proposals that encourage underrepresented early career researchers or early career innovators. And one of my reflections on the proposals that we received in Flexible Fund Round 1 would be that some of the proposals that we received were from established academics with a long history of research funding in other settings, who obviously bring expertise to bear and produced high quality proposals, some of which were about trying to work with early career researchers. But the proposals that fared best in Flexible Fund Round 1 saw those early career or underrepresented researchers or innovators being supported to be the PI rather than the co-I and maybe being supported by established academics. So it isn't a hard and fast rule, but my sense is that our preference would be to support proposals where the underrepresented communities were in the foreground, being supported by established academics rather than the other way around. The research and innovation landscape itself is many and varied in its dimensions, and of course we're therefore interested in interdisciplinary work. We're interested in cross-sector work where you span institutional and or sectoral and or disciplinary boundaries. And that's because we're keen to try and make sure that we focus on the full range of research and innovation settings rather than just defaulting, for example, to thinking about university research and research council funding. And we also mandate that all of our proposals should produce an EDI plan themselves. And that's one of the things that we will evaluate, the quality of that EDI commentary in the EDI plan. Final sets of criteria that we'll be looking at are around the value for money and whether we're going to get a return on our investment of this research time and resource in ways which will maximize the value of what we get. And we are, of course, interested in the robustness of the methodology. Be really clear, there is no specific preference for a particular methodology, but what we are looking for is some reassurance that some thought and craft has gone into articulating how the research will be conducted and what way that will give us reassurance about the robustness of the findings and the generalizability of the findings. By way of an aside, the EDI Caucus has an advisory board, and that advisory board met very recently, I think last week. And one of the pieces of feedback from the advisory board was they really wanted to see innovative and thoughtful and creative methods being used to try and maybe produce step change outcomes faster and more effectively than some traditional methods might allow. So please don't read robustness of methodology to be conservative with a small c, but please do read it as being wanting a level of thoughtful, resilient professionalism around what's proposed, how data will be secured, how access will be secured, how analysis will be conducted, and so on, in order that we get some reassurance about the quality of the outcomes that we might achieve from that. And I think that takes us through the evaluation criteria, Katrine. The mandatory expression of interest has already closed, and we had a total of 63, I think it was, proposals that we gave some early stage feedback on. So if you did make an expression of interest, you either will have or very shortly will have received some high level feedback. The expression of interest was mandatory partly to ensure that we could recruit the right number of reviewers for the review process. And so everybody who's made an expression of interest and had some feedback will have the opportunity to make an application by a deadline of the 15th of May, which seems like a long way away, but of course will zoom towards us. Again, based on feedback from Flexible Fund Round 1 and from the steering group and the advisory board around the EDI Caucus, we've tried to make sure that these deadlines for submission are realistic and not overly tight, so that people have the chance to think about and manage their workload and the other commitments that they may have. Once we have received all of the full applications by that 15th of May deadline, we will do an initial sift around the eligibility requirements that are set out on the EDICa website. And to be eligible for flexible fund funding, you have to, in essence, be eligible for UKRI funding. So to work in a setting where the research councils would be happy to support your research. The project team at the EDI Caucus will then identify reviewers for each project, and that'll be double-blind reviewed, and that'll be completed by mid-June. And then there will be a final stage where those double-blind reviews are put together into a pack that will be reviewed by members of the EDI Caucus with an observer of that process from one of the funding council partners, with the expectation that that process will have completed by mid-July. We would then write out to successful and unsuccessful applicants and move forward with our successful applicants to confirm the acceptance of the award and move forward, just as we have done with those calls that were, those proposals that were funded and that Fenella has put into the chat from Flexible Fund Round 1. So mid-July seems like a lifetime away, I'm sure, for many of us, but it will be here before we know it, and that's a kind of overview of the application process and the timeline. In terms of things that might come up in the question and answer session, the focus of the research project needs to be related to the priorities as set out earlier in the workstream 2 slide. That is, we're really looking to do work which understands and affects practice in those settings where, for example, research funds are being dispersed or research papers or proposals are being considered. And that is the purpose of this second round of flexible funding, and therefore that will be a kind of fit, a good fit with that call will be one of the things that we will seek to evaluate. And we're particularly looking to understand from the research that we commission in Flexible Fund Round 2, what can we learn that we could pass on as good practice to a range of settings right across the research and innovation system. To be absolutely honest with you, it's unrealistic to expect the EDI Caucus to change all of practice in all research and all innovation settings within 3 years, but we really do want to get to a place where we're making early and productive and actionable advice accessible in order that beyond the funding of the caucus itself, there is the likelihood of changes in practice taking hold, becoming widely adopted and improving outcomes for everybody. There are materials available on the website that talk a little bit more about the co-design approach that we ask you to think about, and we would encourage you to think in that co-design about who you might partner with, who might contribute, who the stakeholders around your research might be. If in the period between now and that May deadline for your full submission, you're struggling to find partners, we don't offer a guaranteed dating service or matching service, but we are in contact with lots of organisations that have been in touch with us and are supporting the caucus, and it might be that we already know of somebody who would be interested in talking to you, and where we are able to do so, we would absolutely be delighted to broker introductions and redirect you. I said earlier that the kind of review panel, who would be involved in that process. So there's a question which came in advance of this session about who constitutes that review process. In Flexible Fund Round 2, that was myself and Professor Jemina Napier and Dr. James Richards and Dr. Catherine Souch were the 4 members of the EDI caucus team who oversaw the final process of allocating funding from Flexible Fund Round 1 on the basis of double-blind reviews conducted by a college of reviewers recruited for that purpose up to that point. So it was a 2-phase process where submissions appeared, they were double-blind reviewed, those double-blind reviews were provided to a panel, and that panel made the final judgments. The panel for Flexible Fund Round 2 will be similar, but will be supplemented by an observer from one of our funding consortiums, so it's likely to be somebody from one of the research councils who will sit in on that conversation. And the intention there is to offer us an opportunity to learn lessons in both directions about how best to make final decisions and what kind of policy and practice we ourselves are following. I'm really keen to stress that the EDI caucus, which runs over a 3-year period, is itself a learning system and an opportunity for us to see and trial things and to learn. So the way in which Flexible Fund Round 1 was announced and managed is subtly, but hopefully significantly different from the way in which we're doing Flexible Fund Round 2. And I'm sure that we will learn lessons out of this second iteration, which will influence what we do later this calendar year when we announce Flexible Fund Round 3. And so in terms of the reviewers, what kinds of backgrounds, organisations and disciplines will be represented will depend who makes up that final panel. But last time round, I come from an engineering background and I've spent most of my life in social sciences. Jemina Napier and James Richards are both organisational researchers, and Catherine Souch comes from the Royal Geographical Society. So I hope that answers those kinds of questions, and the intention of recruiting the reviewer college to do the peer blind review process is to reflect the fact that we have people applying for funding from a whole range of different disciplines. And of course, we know that disciplinary norms and subject expertise make a big difference in evaluating research. So we are trying to capture that at that stage. Is that our final slide, Katrine? So I hope that that has been useful. We will share these slides via the EDI Caucus website if anybody wants to go back through those. And if we could stop screen sharing, then I'll have a look in the Q&A facility and I'll ask Katrine and or Vanilla to help me navigate that. So the first of the questions that's come in that process is, can you expand on an EDI plan? So we want to understand from you, the applicant, how you plan to address EDI concerns, and that might be to do with the recruitment of research participants. It might be to do with supporting the research team and or partners. Jemina Napier, who's the EDI lead for the caucus as a whole, has been really helpful in setting out our own EDI plan for the caucus. And I can't remember, Katrine, if that is up on the website or not, but if it isn't, we could look at whether we could share our own EDI plan with potential applicants. So I hope that it's on the website. So that might be a port of call to look at. And many funding calls will ask for standard items around, a statement around research ethics and data management and an EDI plan. And so hopefully that is at least an answer to that question. So I'm not sure what's happened to my screen, but the order skipped around a little bit there. So the next question I can see at the top is, can research adjacent colleagues, i.e. those based in research offices, lead full stage bids? We had that question last time round, and last time round we did consider a bid that was led by someone from a professional service rather than an academic role in a university setting. There are some criteria around eligibility that I referred to earlier, that you have to be working in a context that UKRI would be see you as an eligible recipient of funding. And we have had conversations with the Research Council members of UKRI about that sort of professional service versus academic lead. If there's anybody coming from an innovation setting that isn't inside a university and has a specific question, I would just encourage you to reach out and we will try to answer as quickly as possible. And to be honest, we'll try to answer as creatively as possible, because we're really keen to make sure that it is an inclusive process that has as wide a catchment of potential researchers and participants as possible. So hopefully that answers that question. There's two questions from Lawrence. Can you please expand on what the budget double-blind assessors will be looking for? So in preparing your full proposal, you will be asked to cost that proposal, and we'll look at what the outcomes of that look like relative to the amount of money that you're being tasked with. So the proposals are eligible for cost recovery and time recovery and so on. You might put forward a proposal where you have research partners or collaborators or co-investigators who are willing to make contributions in kind or other forms of access. And again, there isn't a particularly hard and fast rule about that, but we would like to see an explicit statement of what resource you're asking for, what that resource will therefore be used for, and what it's intended to deliver, as we make some balanced assessment of value for money. But I would also point out that value for money is one of a number of criteria, and there isn't some sort of hygiene factor or threshold through which you have to pass in order to be considered eligible. We will simply be looking at what's being proposed, what the consequences of that are, and that'll be one of the things that we would take into account alongside the quality of the EDI plan and so on. So I hope, Lawrence, that answers that question. And your second question is around the sort of interdisciplinary cross-sectional. It might be, for example, if you're wanting to do research with private sector settings in which research and innovation happen, or charitable settings where research and innovation happen, that you yourself work in a university, but you want to partner in a way and have some co-investigator or some research hosting or partnership work with someone. And so that's one form of interdisciplinary or cross-sectional thing. It might be, of course, that your research proposal is to look at the difference between research and innovation careers and experiences and funding allocation processes in some STEM and non-STEM disciplines. That would be a different way of representing interdisciplinarity. There's no obligation on you to do that, but it is given the nature of the research and innovation system in the UK, we are interested in seeing proposals that have as wide a generalizable set of consequences as possible. And many of you on the call, if you have received feedback from your expression of interest, that was one of the things that came up repeatedly in those expressions of interest, where the proposal was around doing some exploratory or pilot work in one discipline, to think about how generalizable insights from that discipline might be to other settings or other disciplines. That's not an ask, and I think when we gave that feedback, we tried to be really clear. It wasn't an ask to make the proposal unmanageable in the time available by trying to do too much, but it was a suggestion that if you're, for example, looking at an arts and humanities setting, that you think, well, how would this apply in other disciplines? Or if you're looking at a clinical or an engineering or a science setting, how applicable would this be in a different type of discipline? So hopefully, Lawrence, that answers that question. Next up, there's a question around the double-blind review process. Yes, there is some guidance in the application process that says, please do try to write particular sections of the application process in a way that don't say, I, Robert Macintosh, based at Northumbria, plan to do this thing. And so we will strip away identifiers from your proposal in terms of sending them out for that first stage of review. And there is some guidance around that. And so if we came across a situation where we felt that your proposal was going to be difficult to review in a way that was completely anonymized, I guess we would come back to you, but we would ask for your help in that. If you have questions about that before you make the final submission, you might want to reach out to us and ask for some guidance or reaction to what you're planning to do. But it's an important part of the process to try and make sure that they are blind reviewed at the outset. And then when it comes to that review panel, of course, the review panel will have sight of who has applied and for how much money and from which institutions. So hopefully for that question, that addresses that. Would you welcome applications to discuss broader aspects of the research and innovation process that aren't directly about the application peer review process? The viewers following the EOI didn't raise this as an issue for our project. Does that indicate that it's been understood as relevant to the work stream? Where we saw proposals at the expression of interest stage that were not aligned to the purpose of the call or the purpose of the EDI caucus, we did signal that clearly. So you should take from that the absence of an explicit statement that this isn't really relevant was feedback that we saw merit in the ideas. The main purpose of the Flexible Fund Round 2 is to look at that process of academic judgment and how that plays out in identifying who gets the career benefits and the opportunities of research funding or innovation funding. But I can see ways in which that might play out in other directions around impact or co-design or research collaborations. And so if you make a compelling case, your proposal will be heard on its merits. Where it's completely misaligned to the caucus, and there were a couple of expressions of interest in this round, and there were a few proposals in Flexible Fund Round 1 that really were not at all related to the purpose of the caucus, and they were either not progressed or they were not rated well in the final evaluation. So I hope that gives you some reassurance that it isn't absolutely a narrow and very specific or precise remit, but there is a focus there that we would ask you to reflect on. Can I share some more information about the budget scale for each project based on round 1 applications and results, please? So we submitted, I can't remember how many projects we received at round 1. I think it was a kind of teens number, 18 or 19 is what sticks in my mind, Katrine, but I can't remember, of which we funded 4. But some of the proposals that we received, at least one of them, would have taken up almost the entirety of the £317,000 that we had notionally allocated. And we faced a difficult decision about, on the one hand, the quality of individual proposals and the potential impact that they had, and on the other hand, trying to fund a range of projects and to create a number of opportunities. So we received 15 applications in the first round and awarded 4. If we had supported 1 or 2 of those projects with a very large budget, we would have funded 1 or at most 2. There isn't a hard and fast rule about that, but we've reflected with the funders consortium that supports the caucus. And we have tried to write slightly more explicitly that we really do want to encourage a range of projects, but we don't want to set a maximum or a minimum spend for those projects, because people come from different circumstances and with different costs associated with their time in different settings. But that's partly why that value for money piece will be in there to think about, is this the most impactful way of achieving the outcomes? So I hope that that gives you some indication of that. Again, if you're troubled by that and want some offline conversation, please do feel free to reach out. But what you probably won't get from us is anything other than the kind of generalities answer that I've offered there, that there is no maximum or minimum, but we would like to support a collection of projects out of Flexible Fund Round 2. Ben's question, EDI can be quite charter oriented, and I would agree with that, and less conceptually driven. Tell us how you might envision the work of theory to a proposal. So I'm just going to try to interpret your question, Ben, and if I misunderstand it, you can always add a supplementary question or reach out offline. First of all, I would agree, and I think that the tendency to think in sort of kite mark and tick list and checklist is well intended, but often has unintended consequences about the way in which people engage with EDI issues and policies and practice around those. We are really interested in high quality work that theorizes what works and why in which circumstances. And so you could well bring forward a proposal which says we're going to work with these participants to try and understand this experience of research or innovation, careers or academic judgment processes or peer review, and bring forward from that some theorizing. So some of the expressions of interest in the very limited word count that was available in that format did allude to that, and that would be great to see. There isn't particularly a focus on 4-star theorizing in the evaluation criteria. We want to see high quality projects that will make a difference in the world. And so I can imagine a project proposal being successful where there is limited evidence that theorizing has happened inside the project and in terms of the outcomes achieved from that project, because mostly the project has focused on delivering policy change or impact or practical differences. But equally, I could imagine projects that are theoretically very rich and diverse in their approach. And equally, I could see projects which deliver outcomes in terms of advice and actionable advice, but which then also subsequently produce journal papers or conference papers or other forms of more traditional academic outputs. And whilst we're talking about that, I would also just encourage you to think a little bit about types of outputs that you might achieve. So traditional academic outputs of the sort I've just outlined are one thing, but you might also find opportunities to reach different audiences in blogs or other types of outputs. And again, in Flexible Fund Round 1, one of the projects that we funded has got some quite innovative ideas about how dissemination will happen and in less traditional formats. So I hope that that answers your question, Ben. Would I please elaborate on the lead applicant eligibility a little bit more? I suppose there's maybe two things that might be in your question there based on what's been said so far. So there's a sort of technical thing, which is in order to be eligible for UKRI funding through the Caucus, you have to be in a role which UKRI would be willing to give you funding from one of their other channels or activities or calls. And so that's one form of lead applicant eligibility. I have pointed to the fact that we did consider a proposal where the lead applicant worked in a university but in a professional service role, and that was slightly unusual in the kind of traditions of UKRI or the Research Council, but was perfectly acceptable in the EDI Caucus and a thing which we actively encouraged. The other thing that I said about lead applicants and eligibility isn't so much an eligibility thing, but more an attitudinal thing, which is in a caucus which is largely about trying to encourage a greater diversity of voices. There would be a preference, I think, for projects which supported those underrepresented and marginalized groups being in the foreground and in the principal investigator role rather than as the research subjects or as the kind of co-investigator. And there isn't a hard and fast rule there either, but I think that in some ways that feels like a more appropriate configuration of a research team, where underrepresented lived experience is brought into the foreground. And so I hope that that gives you 2 or 3 strands around the lead applicant eligibility query for whoever asked that. The question that's following up on budget, we unfortunately are in a circumstance where we will only do this once. It's a one-time round process, so it would be unfair to the other candidate projects that we're evaluating against each other if some projects were encouraged to come back with a different profile of spend or participants or so. The expressions of interest process was partly, as I said, to give us the opportunity to calibrate how many reviewers and in what kinds of disciplines we might want to recruit those reviewers from, but it also gave us the opportunity to give a steer to what happens next in terms of shaping the proposal. But this is not some kind of triple blind review over multiple rounds where you get the chance to adjust to the feedback. So no, I would doubt that we would see the scope for inviting a resubmission with a scaled down budget. I hope that that is clear. What were some of the examples of innovative outputs from round one? The online blurb doesn't yet specify, but there were things to do with theatre and film and blogging and community events in some of those proposals, and I can't remember off the top of my head which one of those it was that was in one of the 4 projects that we did fund. But there were, I thought, some really interesting things which were less traditionally academic outputs that in a context where we're trying to have reach and influence and make a difference to as wide a range of settings as possible, thinking about how people consume knowledge these days is different. We haven't yet seen TikTok or Instagram proposals, but you can imagine that most of us in our everyday life consume new ideas and come across things in ways which aren't just in peer-reviewed journals behind paywalls. And so it was really that was in my mind. And thanks, Katrina. It was film, I think, was the project that we ended up doing some funding with. Kind of proposal build and work that may already have started or create equitable research partners, or does it have to be a completely new initiative? No, it doesn't have to be a completely new initiative. In Flexible Fund Round 1, there were 1 or 2 proposals that did offer views of continuation or extension of work. And I have to just be mindful and just reflect honestly with you as what happened in those circumstances. In one of those proposals, it was a continuation of a big piece of research that had been funded elsewhere with some established PI and co-I players. And again, reflecting what I said earlier in this conversation, so it doesn't have to be a completely new initiative, but I think that one of the lessons there was that underrepresented and marginalized research or innovator careers were not being advanced by doing version 3B of something that had been the life's work of some established academic somewhere else. And so I hope that gives you an honest reflection on where we are, that you don't have to do something completely new. Extension work or translating ideas from one context into another might be a fantastic idea to do. Use the proposal to make as compelling a case about the difference that would make and the benefits that would deliver would be my advice. What if we don't get enough reviewers who could do a blind review of a problem 6 proposal? Each reviewer will be given a small amount of proposals. We've already been through the process of recruiting some reviewers. We are in about the right place now. We think that we would be in a position to ask our reviewers, and we'll do a training session with them before we do that, but we would be in a position where we'd be asking them to maybe look at 2 proposals each. And so we think we'll be in the right sort of territory. And we also have a number of PDRAs from the EDI Caucus itself as a supplement if we need that. But I too had a slight kind of anxiety about that when we saw the number of expressions of interest. It was both fantastic to know that lots of people were interested in the flexible fund and came forward with a whole range, a rich, diverse range of really great and interesting ideas. I did have a bit of an anxiety reaction around needing to find reviewers, but we've done the first part of that process. The proposals aren't yet in, and if we need to go back out to recruit some supplementary reviewers, then we will do that. And we are trying to make sure that those reviewers are drawn from a range of different settings and experiences, as I said earlier. So I hope that answers that question. So that takes us through all of the questions that we've received thus far. I hope that that has been useful. Katrina, I don't know if there's anything that you feel that I haven't covered or you were expecting to come up.
Maybe we can still add that we also offer extra funding about disability support. We have £50,000 that has been allocated to the flexible fund.
Thank you. So that kind of, A, that's a helpful reminder, and B, it reminds me of something related. So if there are particular costs that you would incur in either personally or as a member of the proposed research team, there is a budget to try and address that. So please don't let that be a barrier. Again, I would suggest if you wanted to reach out and ask questions about how to go about that, then please do so. And B, it reminds me of a separate thing, which is there's a sort of mathematical neatness about taking roughly £1 million and dividing it into exactly thirds. And just to say that in Flexible Fund Round 1, we were mindful of not wanting to spend the entire £1 million in year one, but also mindful of the quality of the proposals and the natural tendency for them not all to land on exactly £317,000 for each of the 3 rounds. So that number, which is in the slide deck that I've just presented, is a broad guide. We would have to have a compelling reason to vary very significantly from that, but we won't obsessively try to land on exactly the amount of money in Flexible Fund Round 2, because there is a little bit of flex in how we spend the total amount of the Flexible Fund across the 3 years. We've already committed to 4 projects with a particular price tag. We want to make sure there is some resource left for Flexible Fund Round 3 later this calendar year, but we won't absolutely try to land on £317,000 and no pence at the end of that process. So hopefully that also just gives you some reassurance that you should cost your time and build your proposal in a way which is realistic about the time and energy it will take to do the work. And we will do our best to evaluate them in as fair and transparent a way as possible.
Robert, I was just going to clarify that the £50,000 is in our project for the 3 years of flexible funding support. And it's also something that projects can apply to make some of their output more accessible. For example, BSL and closed captions, as mentioned. Yeah,
and that's a great example of the kind of use of those resources, and much the same as my observation about the 3 years budget of £1 million spent roughly equally. Again, we would want to support proposals where there is a genuine need, but we also have to be mindful of reserving some of those monies for proposals as yet not received for Flexible Fund Round 3, which hasn't been launched yet. So thank you for that clarification, Fenella. So colleagues on the call, thank you for your time and interest in making an expression of interest in Flexible Fund Round 2. It is greatly appreciated. We're excited about the quality of the ideas that we have seen thus far. I hope that this afternoon's session has answered at least some of your questions about the process from here to the eventual allocation of the Flexible Fund for Round 2 and the commissioning of those projects. If you have other questions that emerge, please do feel free to reach out. And I wish you the very best of luck in developing your proposal by May. And I think if there are no further questions, I'll suggest that we just draw to a close there. Just give it a last 30 seconds of slightly awkward silence in case anybody has a last-minute question which you're frantically typing. But like a good tutorial group, I'm going to just imagine that if there isn't something that comes up very shortly, that we will draw to a close. You'll find lots of useful resources on the EDI Caucus website. Katrine and Fenella and myself and the other members of the EDI Caucus team are very happy to answer questions where we can offline. And
Can I do some cross-selling? Mm-hmm. We have a project that's really important to us right now that UKRI have asked us to do in addition to the EDICa work, and that is on the visa and immigration system and about the diversity of the workforce that we are managing to recruit overseas and the barriers that has on particular protected characteristics. So we are looking for as much involvement as possible and putting the the link to the surveys on our website in the chat just now. So we're looking for managers who didn't manage to recruit the staff that they wanted. We're looking for HR and recruiters who don't get the staff that they want. We're also looking for people who've gone through that visa and immigration system in the last 5 years. So it's a wide variety, and it's a really rapid project by the end of UKRI's financial year. So any help that you can provide in boosting that with your colleagues would be really appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Fenella. Either directly or I guess indirectly, you might want to share that call into networks that you're part of where you think there might be people there that could help. And if you didn't see it, I wrote a blog for HEPI, the Higher Education Policy Institute, last week on the somewhat worrying consequences of changes to UK immigration regulations for students and for PGR students and for staff, which do appear to be having quite severe consequences. So it's a very important piece of work. The other piece of cross-selling, to use your phrase, Fenella, would be that we have a fantastic seminar series. We will continue to have that throughout the life of the caucus, and I would just encourage you to stay engaged with the caucus, keep an eye on the website, sign up for the newsletter. I feel like I'm a YouTuber now, saying if you click the bell, you'll get a notification when the next one's available. But do come along to the seminars. They're an opportunity to engage in this area of work, which I'm sure we all share a genuine commitment to. And the seminar series is advertised through the network, and we have a session on peer review bias next month. And we had one just recently on menstrual health, and so I think there's a whole range of things that will come out of the caucus through the seminar series, and they are recorded, so if you wanted to look at them, you could have a look. Thank you again for your time and attention this afternoon, folks. I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon. Look forward to reading your full proposals. Good luck with that process. Thank you, Katrine and Fenella, for setting the session up, and I will bid you a good afternoon.